Tomorrow you will receive an email with the all of the links that we've shared and the recording. Let me just, sorry about this. Okay. So a warm welcome to those of you who've just joined us. My name's Caroline. I'll be your e-moderator today. Julianne is tech support. So if you've got any tech queries, please type those into the Q&A box and we'll help you out with those. So before I introduce our speaker, I just wanted to briefly explain the structure of this webinar. We'll explore the practical ways in which primary teachers and teaching assistants can create a learning environment which is socially, academically and linguistically inclusive. First, Emily will consider the importance of collating and sharing information about new arrivals and how mainstream education can make such a significant impact. Sarah will go on to look more closely at academic inclusion, supporting learners with the learning process and parental engagement. If there's time at the end, Sarah and Emily will take any questions that you may have. So as I said, please feel free to use the Q&A box to send any questions as they come to you and we'll collect them and pose them at the end. Tomorrow, you'll receive an email with us with a link to access the video recording of this webinar together with all of the links that are shared in the presentation. Enough of me now, it gives me great pleasure to introduce our two presenters today, Emily and Sarah. Emily joined the Bell Foundation as a trainer in September 2018. Prior to that, she'd worked in ELT, English language teaching, and taught both adults and young learners in the UK and Thailand respectively, before going on to become a teacher trainer. Emily has a CELTA and Delta and has worked closely with Cambridge Refugee Resettlement Campaign as a liaison for the English language provision. Sarah Moody joined the Bell Foundation in 2021. Her ELT experience spans more than 3 decades and includes English as a foreign language, English as an additional language, and English for academic purposes teaching. And as well as all of that, she has managed and led the EL team on the island of Jersey. She's been a mainstream teacher of secondary English and drama, as well as an EAL teacher working for schools and local authorities, and as such has taught pupils and students aged from 5 to 65 years. So enough of me, I'll hand you over now to Emily. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Caroline. And welcome everybody. It's really great to have so many of you with us today from all over the place in the UK, it looks like, with varying weather, but mostly grey by the sounds of it. And we're going to start off by looking at the learning intentions for the session today. So in this session, we're going to consider challenges commonly faced by newly arrived children from a refugee background and consider a range of resources, strategies and ideas that promote social, academic and linguistic inclusion for newly arrived learners that have a refugee background. And that's so that you feel more informed about social, linguistic and academic support for newly arrived children who are refugees, especially in terms of planning EAL friendly lessons. And also then ultimately so that children from a refugee background feel included and supported, especially with their language development. So first, we're going to look at the superdiversity of learners who come from a refugee background. So UNHCR say for most refugee asylum seeking and stateless children, attending school is one of the most important things they can do to return to normality after being displaced. So with that in mind, I thought we could take a moment to really get into the shoes of learners who arrive into our schools and consider what might be worrying them. So what might be a barrier to them settling and making the most of their education. So first we'll just think about a newly arrived child who has arrived from a school elsewhere in the UK. Not a migrant, not someone who comes from a migrant or refugee background, but just a new child elsewhere in the UK. And I'd like you to write in the chat box, what kind of things, what kind of worries would you have if you were new changing schools? I'll just give you a little 30 seconds or so to type some ideas in there. So we've got, will people accept me? How will I be perceived? What about the English? Will people understand me? How can I keep up with lessons? Where's the toilet? Yeah. Friends. Absolutely. What will the teachers be like? What will the school be like? Lunch. Will I have fun? Yeah, absolutely. Super. Okay, and then moving on from that, we're going to think about what additional worries might you have if you're a migrant. Again, so not from a refugee background, but what additional worries would you have if you're coming to the UK from another country? So, for example, will school be different? So we've got language barrier again. Will I ever make friends? What are the people trying to tell me? Worrying about family at home, culture, timetable, routines, and more culture again. What will the work be like? Will they laugh at me? Will I be respected? Okay, that's religious cultures. Yes, absolutely. Will I be able to pray? Okay, and finally then thinking about if you were a child with a refugee background, what other worries might there be for you? So if you just pop those in the chat box now as well. So I miss home. Will this be permanent? Am I safe? This is a new environment. Where's my family? When will I go home? Yeah, belongings. Will I be treated differently? What's happening to my house? Do I keep up with school back home as well? Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, and food and money, absolutely. So I think, you know, as you've all just demonstrated, children are all very different, and there will, for many of these children who will be coming to our schools, there will be great excitement about starting a new school, new opportunities, new friends, new subjects, new languages. And as you all mentioned as well, it's very normal for teachers to think about the aspects of a child's new life that will be more stressful and present a challenge. So we had lots of your ideas, and here are a few of my ideas about children learning who are coming from elsewhere in the UK. So will I be able to play with the same toys? I miss my old friends, things like that. And then we have, as well as these worries around starting a new school, a child who's new to English and arrives in the UK as a migrant might, perhaps because of parents studying at university, for example, will also be faced with other challenges, including new education systems, teaching styles, and challenges of accessing education in a new language, which many of you picked up on. And then in addition to that, on top of all these challenges, we've got children arriving seeking refuge in the UK, and they'll have very real worries about family and friends back home in their country, and there'll be little escape from these worries every time they see or hear the news, if they're at an age where that's something that they can that happens. So in terms of addressing these needs, schools have well-developed pastoral systems that support children arriving from other schools in the UK. And this is an area schools are experts in, so the orange areas, and will serve them well in meeting the needs of refugees. The concerns that are specific to those seeking refuge include needs around trauma and the rights of refugees, as you picked up on, and much of the focus of welcoming refugees centres around these areas, and rightly so, to ensure that families who are dealing with abrupt and major changes feel safe, welcome and supported. So this afternoon, we're going to be thinking in particular about language support, but aware that there is crossover between well-being, language development and academic achievement. So the Education Policy Institute published a report in December, which looks at the educational outcomes of refugees, which is an area lacking in research. The report reveals that unaccompanied asylum-seeking children are a highly vulnerable group, with very low attainment even by comparison with other vulnerable groups of pupils, and experiencing higher than average rates of school absence and fixed period exclusions. So this is unaccompanied asylum-seeking pupils. And so that's why we're here today, to think about how to reduce these gaps in attainment so that learners who are refugees can reach their potential. It would be tempting to look at the EPI report and assume that there's merit in a one-size-fits-all support package for all children who are refugees, but like all children we work with, children who arrive seeking refuge are a heterogeneous group. And a useful way of considering some of the factors impacting on refugees is to consider their experiences before leaving their home country, during the journey, and finally on arrival. I'll briefly consider some of these aspects in a moment. And these diverse groups who fall under the label refugee or asylum seeker also have a huge range of strengths and needs. And it will be vital that schools get to know their new children and their families. And one thing all groups possess, however, are rich, meaningful cultural backgrounds and different types of knowledge from diverse histories and experiences. And even if a child arrives speaking no English at all, they'll have some knowledge of their own languages, and this is likely to prove their greatest asset from which all teachers can build. So in terms of different experiences prior to arrival, children are likely to have had very different experiences. For example, they may have witnessed violence and death, including potentially that of family members, or they may have experienced separation from family members. They may have experienced fear and uncertainty and also that of their parents. And they'll almost certainly have experienced disruption to normal life, such as healthcare, education, and the availability of everyday essentials, including food, water, and fuel. Some children might have had significant disruption to their education, and so their subject knowledge may not be where we might expect. Their experiences and schooling of each child will be different, so some children might have been homeschooled, for example, maybe by a neighbour or family friend. Others might not be literate in their home language, and some children may not have attended school in their home country at all for one reason or another. In terms of transmigration, children may have travelled in many different ways, perhaps directly by an organised flight, or a long, difficult journey through several countries, possibly in the hands of traffickers, and possibly separated from family members. They may have spent long periods of time in refugee camps, or have spent time living in another country. And in all of those places, they may have had other experiences of education and language learning. Children might have different experiences of the asylum process. So thinking now about post-migration, they might arrive to a settled long-term home, to a short-term accommodation, which will mean more upheaval, or perhaps even to nothing at all. They might also be experiencing isolation when they arrive, confusion and stress, and their families may have experienced a loss of status and income as a result of arriving in a new country. As well as this, some families will be facing complicated asylum processes and complicated process for getting a school place, accessing healthcare, and so on. Some families will arrive and be part of an established community, whereas other families might arrive in isolation and may end up living in more remote areas with less access to support, including language support. So bearing this diversity in mind then, let's take a moment to look at two fictional children, fictional but based on similar real cases. So first we have Sophia. She's from Ukraine and she's 6 years old and she's had no previous schooling. She survived bombing and until recently was living in a temporary hostel in Poland with her mother and older sister, but has been separated from her father. So she's now living with a caring UK host family in the UK who do not speak Ukrainian but are keen to help. She presents as lively and cheerful most of the time, but has sudden outbursts of tears. Okay, next we have Sajad, a child from Afghanistan who's 9 years old. He's had very disrupted schooling due to war and displacement and is currently living in a hostel in the UK in the care of his older brother due to his parents having passed away. But despite all this, he appears alert and keen to learn. He speaks Dari and Arabic and knows some English, but cannot read or write in any language. As you can see, they're very different children in terms of age, language, and life experiences. But what they have in common is that they both have been forced to flee their own countries, and they've both just arrived at primary school in the UK. So we're going to look at good practice in terms of social, academic, and linguistic support for new EAL arrivals and examine how this works well in practice for these two children, these two very different children throughout the rest of the webinar. Okay, before we go on to look at social and academic inclusion, we're going to first look at what kind of information it's important to collect when a child from a refugee background starts school in the UK. Okay, so we can see the importance of not generalizing about a child who is a refugee, because the label tells us very little. And so it'll be important to gather as much relevant information as possible, but remembering to be sensitive. So for example, we don't need to ask about traumatic experiences. So ideally, one way to gather as much useful information for the school and at the same time provide a supportive welcome for the child and their family is to have a meeting and tour of the school before the child starts. At this point, it's useful to have an interpreter for the tour of the school. If possible, a professional interpreter, but we understand that can be difficult. Possibly also using members of the community, though, where larger numbers of refugees have arrived in a safe area together. So this would be a great opportunity to empower members of the community who want to be more involved in supporting their own community to settle. At this time, you can also introduce key staff and children that will be working with the newly arrived pupils during the tour of the school, so they know who to go to on their first day, and there's some familiarity there. It might also be useful to anticipate any documentation that would be useful to complete before the tour of the school so that the interpreter can support with this. It's also important to share translated information about the curriculum. We can't assume that families will already know this information, and wherever possible, provide translated printed version of any key information about the school, such as school start times, expectations, and so on, so that families have a printed copy to refer back to. The Bell Foundation has a document on the UK education system and how it works, and that's been translated into a number of different languages, more than 19, I think, and that includes Dari, Arabic, and Ukrainian, which you can find on the website. I think Caroline will put a link to it in the chat box in a minute, but you can see a screenshot of it there. It's also, before the learner starts, also a good opportunity to ask about uniform and any other potential expenses, so you can get that ready so that when the learner's fully equipped when they actually come on their first day. And it can be a good opportunity to find out key information about the learner and start getting to know them as an individual, and in do so creating a positive relationship with the family, the child, and showing that you're genuinely interested. So a little bit more information about what kind of stuff might go into a pupil profile in just a moment. And in terms of practical things to do before the meeting with the parents, so before they come for the tour of the school, it might be worth finding out if home language teaching support staff are available, or if there's any support on offer from local authorities, academy chains, or charities. There is an EAL factor included in the national funding formula, which means that schools should receive an additional funding for pupil who uses EAL for the first 3 years after they're recorded in the October census. The funding follows the child if they move school, and although the funding is no longer ring-fenced, it should be used to provide English language support, whether this is through the use of TAs, interpreters, or so on. So worth knowing about. It's also worth finding out if there are any relevant supplementary schools or cultural centres that can support the learners, especially in maintaining their home language and potentially accessing the curriculum in their home language, which might be particularly important if these children are able to go back home again. And there might also be local refugee support organisations who can support newly arrived families in a number of ways. So getting the contact details for these would be really useful, not only in practical terms, but perhaps also as a way of helping those newly arrived families find a community. And lastly, consider if there's any counselling available for perhaps both the children, the parents, and also to support staff. Okay, so coming back now to thinking about a pupil profile. So with the initial interview with the family, it can be useful to find out as much as possible, including how to pronounce and write the child's name correctly. So it's a really simple thing that can make a really big difference. And it is fine to ask if you're not sure. So I think rather than continuing to repeat the child's name incorrectly, just ask. Nobody will mind, but it can have a big impact on a child if their name is being pronounced incorrectly. And there's also a useful guide called Getting It Right, which is a reference guide for registering children with non-English names. It explains, for example, how first and last names work and transfer in different countries. So in the UK, the last name of the parents becomes the last name of the children, but in other countries, it's not necessarily the same. It's also important to find out about prior schooling, including any favourite subjects of the learners, find out about the hours of the school day, where they were previously at school, if at all, and what age they started school, because different schools in different countries children start school in different countries at different times, different ages. In terms of an official proficiency in English assessment, we recommend waiting 3 or more weeks, as it gives the learner time to settle in and therefore demonstrate what they know and can do in English. But at the initial meeting, you might be able to get a broad idea of the learner's proficiency in English so that you're ready to put in some support on the first day. As well as this, it's worth finding out about the various languages and literacies that the child and their family use. So, for example, some learners or family members may speak more than one language, but they may not be literate in all those languages, or they may have good social English, but their reading and writing may be less developed. Finding out about the learner's home situation can also help you understand the type of provision they have for learning at home and better understand their needs as an individual. So, for example, you may want to find out who they're living with, if there is a family member or a caregiver who speaks English that can serve as a key point of contact, if they're living in a permanent or temporary accommodation, or if the learner has any responsibilities such as caring for younger siblings or relatives. And of course, it's important, as I mentioned before, to be sensitive, as you don't want to bring up anything traumatic. So avoid asking questions about how they came to the UK or what happened to other members of their family. And of course, useful to find out about religious observances, dietary needs, and the learner's favourite sports, hobbies, and interests. So a couple of tools here that can help you with this collating information. So Southeast Grid for Learning has developed an online background collation tool for new arrivals, which enables you to gather information in a range of languages. It includes languages spoken by some refugees, such as Arabic and Albanian, and they've just let us know that they're in the process of adding Ukrainian as well. I think Caroline's going to put the link to that in the chat. And you may also want to look at the CubeX tool, which also gathers background information on learners in a number of different languages. The tool is currently in its trial phase, so if you already have a system for collecting this information in place, you might be interested in trying out CubeX to see how it compares. And I know that they're keen to get feedback on the tool as well, if you do decide you want to have a look at that. So in the webinar today, we're going to go on to look at social and academic inclusion, but I just want to flag how important it is to consider the effects of stress and trauma on children who are refugees, as this is something that will clearly affect a child's ability to learn and feel settled in a school. So today we're just focusing primarily on language support, and we're not the experts in stress or trauma, but we would strongly recommend that you read the UNHCR booklet around this. I found it really useful and very informative. It explains how stress and trauma affect a child, their ability to learn, their behaviour, and it outlines what teachers can do to support that child in class. So really, really useful guide there. Okay, so we've looked at what information together. We're going to go on to look at the value of including learners in mainstream classes. So for the most part, children who are newly arrived will benefit from joining mainstream lessons as soon as possible. Michael Evans et al. Elaborate on this in their book, Towards an Inclusive Pedagogy for EAL in the Multilingual Classroom, and that's chapter 6. So at its simplest, in the classroom with their peers is the best place for social, academic, and linguistic inclusion. In terms of social inclusion, classroom learning with opportunities for collaboration and discussion are an excellent means of fostering relationships and friendships between learners. And the aim is for a child to feel as settled and as involved as possible. So joining mainstream classes early helps learners to bond with their first language English peers more quickly. Joining mainstream lessons early also promotes academic inclusion, as it means that learners don't lose the optimal opportunity for subject matter learning. The classroom teacher is the best source of academic learning, as they are the subject experts. And lastly, mainstream lessons provide linguistic inclusion in that different teachers and different children will provide models of all the varieties of English from which newly arrived learners will benefit. New arrivals, refugees or otherwise, offer great advantages to the classroom, such as their unique cultural heritage. Including and welcoming refugees into mainstream classes can also be hugely beneficial for non-refugee children, as it can encourage empathy and understanding. Allowing learners to learn about refugees before a refugee child starts school, if you have that information ahead of time, perhaps, can help with this. And UNHCR also has a guide for teachers on teaching about refugees with some example activities in it that you might want to dip into. And just to note on out of class intervention. So we understand that there may be a case for withdrawal classes for children who are new to English who have complex strengths and needs. For example, some learners might not be literate because of disrupted schooling and will therefore need extra literacy support. And we would say that if withdrawal does need to take place, it's most effective if it's time limited and curriculum focused. So we understand that for learners who are new to English, there may be some need to focus on survival language at the start, but it's important that this doesn't happen at the expense of curriculum learning. So it might be about finding a balance between survival language and curriculum support. One approach could be to use withdrawal sessions to equip learners with the language needed for upcoming curriculum lessons. So you might want to prepare children for a science lesson by helping them understand the use of present simple to present scientific facts. But it's also worth thinking carefully about what lessons children are being taken out of and to avoid withdrawal from core subjects. Okay, so we're going to go on to look now at social inclusion, which is crucial in helping learners feel safe and secure in their new school, especially for children who come from a refugee background. Social inclusion also plays a really important role in helping learners develop their English language skills, as much language development takes place through social interactions. So we'll be looking at buddies, extracurricular activities, lunchtimes, conversation club, and safe spaces. So setting up a buddying scheme can really help with social inclusion. Buddies can make up part of a support network for the new child, and they understand the school from a child's perspective, which is invaluable for newly arrived children. Buddies can be assigned to newly arrived children, including those seeking refuge, before school starts. And ideally, the buddies would meet the new arrival before their first day, so the new arrival knows who to turn to and they've got a familiar face on that first day at school. Buddies work best when there is a small group of them, as we can see in the picture, and if they're carefully selected. So ideally, these buddies would be kind and empathetic and provide a positive role model, both in terms of English language and expectations around behaviour. Ideally, wherever possible, at least one of the buddies might also share the same language as the new arrival. It's preferable to work with a selection of buddies, as it means the learner has more than one person to go to and might go to different buddies for different things. And it also ensures that it doesn't become too overwhelming for the buddies, as the responsibility is shared out. And it's for this reason, it's also really useful to ensure that buddies have a teacher or adult in the school that they can check in with regularly, both in terms of their own well-being and to communicate any concerns about the well-being of the newly arrived learner. One such scheme that does buddying particularly well is the Young Interpreters Scheme from Hampshire MTAS. In this scheme, interested children who are speakers of other languages, along with monolingual English speakers, who are proud of their school and want to help new arrivals, are trained to interpret using either the home language or accessible English. They can't obviously deal with sensitive information, but they're able to show them around, answer their questions, and provide a friendly face during a stressful time. Other curricular activities can also be a great way to ensure the new children are included socially. So things like sports clubs, arts clubs, community gardening, and other interests of the learners, as they give learners the opportunity to connect with other children in a structured way that still lets them be creative and develop the necessary social English. Art and gardening might be particularly nice, as they can be very therapeutic. It's also worth being aware, though, of any costs tied up with extracurricular activities such as football kits, because learners might need support in accessing these. And in terms of sporting activities, also be mindful of changing arrangements. as children might have scars or be sensitive about particular parts of their bodies due to trauma. So you might want to consider if they're separate changing areas, or perhaps a way for the child to arrive already changed. Conversation clubs are also great for improving social English and social inclusion. They can be run like cafes, with learners sitting at tables with volunteers and talking. So you might want to provide conversation prompts or an activity like a board game or a jigsaw puzzle. And volunteers could be peers, older pupil, or volunteers from outside the school, such as university students. And finally, it's just worth bearing in mind that lunch and break times can be quite stressful. There's a lot of noise, moving around, and they're less structured times. So it can be useful then for children to know that there's a safe space they can go to during these times. Lots of schools already obviously have such initiatives in operation, and it might be a case of simply introducing the learner and making sure that they have any necessary passes. Or it might be that you want to set something up. The safe space could be a classroom, a room already designated as a safe space or quiet space, or maybe you have something set up as part of your nurture provision. Conversation club is another example of a safe space which could be provided at lunchtime. And yeah, just to flag again that it's useful for the learner to know where these places are before they arrive or on their first day, so that they can find them easily. And I'm going to pass over to Sarah now, who's going to touch on a look at academic inclusion and working with parents and carers.
Okay. Okay, hello everybody, and thanks for coming. We're going to go on something strange has happened.
I think you're in the right place there, Sarah.
Yeah, I don't know what happened there. Okay, so we've looked at what information to gather and at social inclusion, and now we're going to go on to look at academic inclusion, thinking particularly about EAL inclusive pedagogy, the importance of translanguaging, and a range of classroom strategies and resources. So, on the 4th of May, the Secretary of State for Education published a letter to schools and local authorities regarding people fleeing Ukraine. In the letter, he wrote that schools are responsible for ensuring that all their pupils, including refugees and migrants who have a first language other than English, develop the English language skills needed in order to access the curriculum and achieve their potential. In the next section, we'll be looking at specific strategies and ideas you can use for that exact purpose. Let's begin then by thinking about EAL pedagogy. It differs in key ways from other language teaching pedagogies, such as modern foreign language or English as a foreign language. A learner in their country of origin may learn English at school. In Ukraine, for example, they start learning English as early as year 1. But outside of those lessons, the pupils' social life, their clubs and activities, all of their other curriculum subjects will happen, of course, through the mother tongue. In their English as a foreign language lessons in school, they learn vocabulary and grammar in a linear, logical way, probably present tenses before past and vocabulary grouped into sort of neat sections, etc. However, when they join a school here in the UK, of course, the entire curriculum is suddenly taught through the English language. So the pupil has to learn English and curriculum areas such as geography and biology through English. Therefore, of course, the teachers also have a double job to do. They need to be teaching English language at the same time as teaching the curriculum. This means that the English language won't be taught and learned in that linear logical way, starting with present tenses and working through grammar and topics. It'll be acquired in a much more messy and organic way. So a pupil, for example, might be using a present tense to describe a process in science, and then a mixture of past and present tenses, talking about the Romans in a history lesson, some future tenses, perhaps making predictions in maths, all this in one morning. So EAL pedagogy is about providing scaffolding for the EAL learner to acquire English through the context and alongside curriculum subject learning. When thinking about academic inclusion, we need to consider three main underpinning principles. Firstly, that plurilingualism is an asset. The ability to use more than one language is a skill which EAL pupils bring with them, whether they're new to English or not. Learners actively use the languages they already know to learn English, and these languages they already know are the most valuable resources that they have to draw upon in their acquisition of English and additional languages. Secondly, that cognitive challenge in lessons and in work can and should be kept appropriately high. Children need exposure to high quality curriculum content, not a watered down curriculum. And thirdly, that language acquisition goes hand in hand with cognitive development. So in the following slides, we'll look at strategies that can be used in line with these key principles. I talked in a previous slide about EL learners who are immersed in English medium schools, acquiring English in what I called an organic, messy way. It's a bit similar to how toddlers acquire their first language. They hear it spoken around them and to them every day. They observe how it's used, then they start to imitate it, and they work out what they have to say in particular situations. They practice it, they refine it, they make mistakes, they correct mistakes. Now, children with EAL, of course, have already done this. They've already experienced this kind of acquisition once when they learned their first or subsequent languages. And it's that knowledge of words and concepts and that feel for how a language works, which will help them to gain a new one. Polyglots always say that the more languages they know, the more easily they learn the next one. So language skills are transferable. Anything a learner needs to know, anything a learner knows how to say or write in one language, they can learn to express in another. Depending on how much schooling they've received already, EAL learners may already have significant curriculum knowledge, which they've learned through one language and which they now need to be able to transfer to English. So their first language really is the most important tool for learning that they bring with them. And therefore it's important not to see EAL learners who are new to English as blank slates, or to apply a deficit model and see them as lacking in English, but rather to welcome them as linguistically competent, rich resources who will be an asset to the school. Of course, a child's home language is also integral to their identity, their sense of connection with their family and community. And in that sense, rejecting a child's language is essentially to reject the child. So, speaking other languages is an asset, so take an asset-based approach. Incorporate multilingualism into the culture of the school. This needs to start, obviously, with an active language policy, but what does it look like in practice? In practice, walking through a school, it might look like signs and classroom displays which show that a variety of languages are in everyday use. It might look like books in a range of languages in the library, well-thumbed ones. It might look like groups of young interpreters who are active and high profile. And it can sound like children using their languages in classrooms, in corridors, in playgrounds, with pride and confidence in both academic and social situations. It can sound like music from many cultures being part of assemblies or celebration. It can sound like staff greeting children in different languages, teachers calling the register in different languages, parents coming in to read stories or sing songs from around the world. If schools truly buy into the idea that knowledge of languages other than English is an asset, then they will encourage children to draw on this knowledge and weave it into their play and into their learning. And this in turn will lead to an enriched, dynamic and vibrant school environment. On top of that, there's plenty of research to show that proficiency in more than one language leads to better academic outcomes. So that'll be reflected in the school too. A translanguaging approach in the classroom entails the planned and intentional use by some children of more than one language in an activity or a series of activities. It means that learners can harness their prior knowledge. It means that learners can use the full repertoire of languages at their disposal in order to maximise their output and their learning. So again, what does it look like? Well, it might look like a child writing in their first language and then translating it. Perhaps writing a more complex story in their first language and using this to construct some simpler sentences in English. Maybe the teachers provided a scaffold to help them do this. It could also include something like labelling a diagram or taking notes in one language and then using these notes to ensure the final output in English. It might sound like children rehearsing a drama piece using a mixture of languages and then presenting it in English or presenting it bilingually. Or it might sound like children having an animated discussion about healthy diets in, say, Arabic before feeding back to the class in English. It might be that our case study, Sophia, looks at a picture book and tells the story in her first language with a small group of Ukrainian speakers or a volunteer parent, and then listens to the same story being told to the class in English. Perhaps Sajjad is able to use a translation app to hear some key words from a topic spoken in Arabic, perhaps about magnetism, and then compile his own bilingual glossary using Arabic and English, which you can later refer to in class. You can facilitate learning through translanguaging by building a secure environment in your school or class where multilingualism is viewed as an asset rather than a barrier, and this positive message comes across to the learners. Aim to build a secure environment where learners are happy and proud to learn to use their first language if they wish to. You can do this through seating plans and through setting tasks where plurilingualism is an asset, and also by careful groupings and pairings of learners. Grouping children by home language is useful when the focus is on learning new content, as it will allow learners to discuss their understanding of concepts in their first language. Using mixed language groups or trios is useful, especially if, as in this task, the learners with EAL will suddenly be catapulted to the status of expert. Of course, many classes and schools will have isolated learners, perhaps just one learner who speaks, for example, Pashto. In these cases, it's all about the use of bilingual materials, including translation technology, and about grouping the child with sympathetic first language English speakers too. Researchers into translanguaging, such as Garcia and Lee, argue that giving EAL learners the opportunity to use their full language repertoire empowers them and enables them to reach their full potential. Let's have a look at some resources then. Storybooks Canada is a free online library with a range of storybooks that promote bilingualism. The stories are available in a number of languages, including using text and using audio. Learners can listen to a story at their level in English and or in their own language. The books and languages are easy to access on the website. You just click on a story, which then allows you to click on the Change Language tab, and then click on the listening icon if you want to listen to the story. You can also download the story in the chosen language and print it out, which is great for sharing with parents and carers. This is a good way to promote and nurture home languages as well as developing English. And you might want to consider maybe getting older children to read to younger children who share their language, or involving parents and carers. Mantralingua, I'm sure many of you are familiar with them. It's another great source of bilingual books, so we thought it's worth a shout out here, including many classroom classics such as The Hungry Caterpillar. Mantralingua have created printed books that actually talk by the use of a talking pen, and the latest version has a Bluetooth speaker. Books can also be accessed as ebooks, and there are packs of story prompt cards for retelling. These dual language resources are not free, but they're well worth exploring and considering investing in, whether for classroom use, for the library or reading corner, or to send home for children to read with their parents and carers. If you're able to, it can be a great idea to locate textbooks in your learner's first language, so they can read about the curriculum topic in their first language before or at the same time as engaging with the same topic in English. They could read about the topic in their first language for homework, for example, perhaps again involving their parents and carers, or maybe in the first minutes of a lesson at school. It can also be worth reaching out to any local community or community language schools, as they may have resources they can share. Having said that, of course, it's important not to assume that all learners have age-appropriate literacy in their first language. Many children seeking asylum, for example, have had sporadic access to formal schooling. For older learners, the Khan Academy is a useful resource as well. There are lessons and lectures on a vast number of topics and subjects taught in schools. They're provided in over 50 languages, and many others have subtitles translated into other languages. These videos can be watched prior to a lesson, dependent on the length. They can be watched right at the beginning of the lesson, or they can be watched at home to help with the understanding of your topic. There is some content available in Ukrainian and also in Arabic. So a child, like our fictional case study, Sajjad, might be able, for example, to watch a lesson entitled An Introduction to Magnetism in Arabic, which will prepare him for upcoming class work. So now we're going to think about some strategies to use in your classroom for new to English learners. I'm aware that we've got quite a broad spectrum of contexts represented in our participants this afternoon. So obviously you'll need to all filter out what would work for you, for your school or for your class. Before we look in more detail at these strategies, or a selection of them anyway, it's worth reminding ourselves that this kind of pedagogy might be very new to some EAL learners, including those seeking sanctuary, who might already be finding UK schools quite different from their previous educational settings. Perhaps they're unused to working in pairs or groups, perhaps they're unused to talking very much in class or to sitting not facing the front. And for these reasons, they might appear reluctant to participate at first. So you'll need to approach these activities gently, modelling exactly what to do at each stage. And it's also worth considering, in the case of refugees and asylum seekers, that if a child has lost a trusted adult, sadly, either through death or through migration or through imprisonment, they might find it hard to trust that other adults will not leave them too. And therefore, they might find it difficult to take their turn or to do work without constantly asking for the teacher's help. Conversely, if children have experienced violence or unkindness at the hands of adults, they may not trust adults to help them. They may be scared of making mistakes and therefore not ask for help at all. So we need to be sensitive to these behaviours, the stories which may be behind them, and use, as always, maximum patience and kindness. So one of the ways of keeping the cognitive challenge high is to use lots of visuals. And one way of using visuals is to use flashcards. It's a great way of helping learners to understand the content of a lesson or curriculum area. They're quite easy to source. We've got lots on the Bell Foundation website. Quizlet is a great source of online ones. And they help learners understand the content of a lesson or a curriculum areas. We can use them to teach vocabulary needed for a lesson or for a unit of work in advance, or to consolidate it afterwards. Captions can be provided in English and or another language. And words and images from the flashcards can be used as a stimulus for sequencing, telling or writing a story. Bingo is a kind of extension of flashcards, really, and it's a useful consolidation at the end of a lesson or a warmer at the start of one. It can be done from the front with a teacher or a chosen child calling the words, or it can be organised into smaller groups. This example is from the Bell Foundation resource on a balanced diet, where children are learning about different nutrients the body needs and why. To be as inclusive as possible, you could adapt this resource by including pictures of food that learners from your class are used to eating. You could also add words to the pictures for added support. You can imagine how EAL children such as Sophia and Sajjad would benefit from the word picture association and the repetitive language used. And of course, this is adaptable to almost any curriculum topic. Keeping the cognitive challenge high, substitution tables provide a great scaffold to help learners with EAL to structure their speaking and writing in English, whilst keeping that cognitive challenge high. They provide grammar and vocabulary that learners can use and repeat, thus improving and consolidating their knowledge about the English language and enabling learners to produce accurate sentences, even though they're quite new to English. In our example on this screen, learners use the substitution tables to talk about Tudors in a Key Stage 2 history lesson. But again, you could adapt that to many, many different contexts, and you can use a mixture of words and pictures, or you can use just words, and you can use translated words or just English words. Collaborative learning is useful for both listening and speaking. Children co-construct their learning through talk. It's a great opportunity for practicing subject-specific vocabulary in a context. This particular collaborative task is an example of an information exchange or a barrier game where learners have some information, but the other information is missing, so they have to ask their partner. And this encourages meaningful communication. In this activity, learners would be practicing using classifying words like reptile, amphibian, etc., and also words for animal body parts such as fins, feathers, and gills. Now, you could modify this task for a child who's new to English, and instead they could be given a listening frame and asked to tick off certain words as they hear them. You might also want to use speaking frames to help learners ask and answer the questions needed to play the game. Activities such as this one are designed to support reading for meaning and therefore develop language acquisition within academic development. So rather than check for overall understanding of a text, which tends to assume fluency in a language, these focus on the meaning of individual words or phrases or paragraphs. There are lots of examples on the Bell Foundation website. This one is actually from the excellent Racing to English. Such activities often focus on just one aspect of language or one grammatical structure at a time. For instance, here it's the word so and how this can connect two statements. And learners have to match the beginning and end of sentences to create meaningful and correct ones. There are many other DARTS activities, and you can access them on the Bell Foundation's Great Ideas page. Graphic organisers can help structure learners' thought to writing process, enabling language acquisition and academic development to go hand in hand. Graphic organisers are visuals, all kinds of visuals, such as this Venn diagram here, or cause and effect diagrams, or cycle diagrams, and they present logical relationships between different elements. So if the learner first completes information on their graphic organisers, this then helps them to organise their thinking and facilitate the writing process. The example here shows animal classification, but they're endlessly adaptable to all kinds of subjects. For example, before and after the Roman invasion, or comparing two characters in a story. They work effectively as a group activity before moving on to individual writing, or the other way around. A fun way to do them is to use big plastic hoops and then sort on the table to make the Venn diagram, and then sort flashcards with images or statements into the different sections that you make. Games of all kinds are great for developing language acquisition, as they involve focused speaking and listening in small groups. They involve turn taking, and they involve lots and lots of repetition. This example from the excellent collaborativelearning.org site teaches the language of probability through a Connect 4 game. So learners would then be able to apply the language they'd learnt, words such as impossible, unlikely, etc., to other areas of social and academic life, as well as their maths lesson. Let's consider then how what we've looked at applies to our case studies from earlier. Sophia hasn't been to school before, as compulsory education hadn't started yet in her country when she had to flee. Sophia is 6, and compulsory education in the Ukraine starts in year 1. Many Ukrainians, however, attend nursery schools, and many can read and write to a certain extent before they start school in year 1. So it would be a good idea to check this with her mother, who might also appreciate some Ukrainian language or bilingual books to read at home, because it's unlikely that they were able to bring very much with them. Sophia needs to be with children who are good role models of both behaviour and language, because new arrivals will always copy what they see and they hear. She'd benefit from being part of small groups, playing games and collaborative activities, and being allowed to be silent and just watch at first, because she is a bit shy and, as it said at the beginning, a bit prone sometimes to emotional outbursts. When she's had time to settle, though, and give her plenty of time, maybe a whole term, but when she's had time to settle, conduct a proficiency in English assessment and start to track her progress in English language acquisition. As Sajjad has had a very disrupted education through no fault of his own, when he's had time to settle and been assessed, he might benefit from some catch-up tutoring in literacy, perhaps in both English and Arabic, if that could be arranged. Connecting with some supplementary schools, if any are available locally, would help him both socially and academically. In class, he'd benefit from opportunities to talk and listen, so board games, barrier games, participating in group projects, even if as a silent partner at first, as well as lots and lots of visual and audio aids, such as pictures, videos, and talking books, while he learns to connect sound to letters. As he becomes able to read and write, then the strategies like substitution tables and reading for meaning activities will help him develop his literacy at the same time as learning subject content. If Sajjad is able to take home books in Arabic or bilingual books, he could read them with his brother, and he could also take home flashcards to practice new vocabulary. I'm going to do just a couple of quick slides on the early years and foundation stage, because it's kind of like a discrete unit. First of all, I'd say don't make any assumptions, because each and every child will be different. I'm sure every EYFS practitioner knows this anyway. Some asylum-seeking children have suffered and continue to suffer trauma, and this might show in their behaviour or demeanour. Others will jump straight in, delighted to play with other children and attracted by the toys and games on offer. Find out as much information as you can from parents. What skills the child has. For example, whether he or she can count in their first language, whether he or she can hold crayons, and so on. Also consider what prior experience the child has. Has he or she attended a playgroup setting before? Is he or she familiar with the concept of listening to stories or singing songs, chanting rhymes? If the child appears very nervous, then it might be worth considering easing them in with phased entry and just observing them closely. When the child starts, you'll want to allow them plenty of time before any assessments are carried out. And if you're under pressure to begin literacy or phonics programs, allow, if you can, as much time as you possibly can for the new arrivals to begin to make sense of this new language and this new world first. So in class, what can you do? Well, speak slowly and clearly and model what you want children to do. Provide a running commentary, talking through actions and ideas. This provides language teaching in a meaningful context, so just talk all the time that you're doing something. Some children might want to observe others before joining in. Sharing stories, songs and rhymes in home languages helps build a bridge between home and school environments, a crucial bridge. It also reinforces similarities and patterns of languages, so consider inviting parents in to share these in a listening area. Allow children who share a language to play together, as well as mixing with others. Continue to build these bridges between home and school by having objects in role play areas which are familiar to the children from their homes. So you might include objects of costumes or play foodstuffs from a variety of cultures to reflect the diversity and cultural richness of the class. And finally, it's all about talk. So it's an ideal environment for acquiring language. Therefore, it can be useful to provide as many opportunities as possible for social interactions through games and activities. Okay, so now we've looked at ideas for academic inclusion of learners with EAL. We're going to finish by exploring ways of working potentially with the parents and the carers. So, parents and carers of refugee and asylum-seeking children are often thought to be quite a hard group to reach. As always, they're a super diverse group, and so it's important not to generalise. But there's just some things you might want to bear in mind. Firstly, they've been through a lot. Everything their children have suffered, plus usually quite a bit more. Parents may be suffering from the effects of trauma themselves, whilst also trying to care for traumatized children. And in some cultures, there's a taboo around mental health, and parents may be reluctant to admit they need help, reluctant to ask for it, or unsure of where the help exists. They're in an unfamiliar culture. The customs and the school system here may seem very strange to them, and certain cultural events such as birthday parties, birthday cakes, sleepovers may seem alien to them. This in turn can lead to tension between them and their children, who usually want to fit in. Parents seeking asylum often feel isolated, and this is compounded in many cases by not being allowed to work. Many asylum-seeking families, although not all, are living in poverty and may worry about providing equipment, money for treats, trips, etc. Sajjad, cared for by an adult sibling in a hostel, will be living on very little money, and the brother would not be allowed to work. Sophia, on the other hand, in her host family and coming from the Ukraine, might be living more comfortably, and her mother might eventually find work to support her. Need to mention unaccompanied asylum seekers. These are usually older children, they're usually older teenagers, but occasionally they do include primary age children, and they may be being cared for by foster carers or in residential care homes. If this is the case, make sure that the school develops a strong relationship with the care setting and that carers are briefed on how best to support them in their schoolwork, their acquisition of the English language, and also on the importance of maintaining that first language, which the carers in this case may not share. So, some things that schools can do. The most important thing that schools can do to help parents is to look after their children, keep them safe, happy, and learning. As well as that, parents need to feel that they're an important and valued part of the school community, so make them welcome, listen to them, invite them in. This may entail arranging parents' evenings where they can meet each other, as well as having an introduction to the school and how it works, perhaps an overview of the UK system. The Bell Foundation has some useful documents about the UK system, which are translated into a variety of languages, including Ukrainian. Interpreters would be very useful here. Better still if there are members of staff from the same community or who speak parents' language. Providing translations of key documents such as uniform policies, homework policy, curriculum outlines, etc., will make parents feel more involved and less isolated, and this in turn will result in better outcomes for their children. Many parents need to learn English, and some schools are able to host ESOL lessons on site for parents who need them. If this is a possibility, then a creche is a very useful addition here. If this is not a possibility, find out where the local free lessons are taking place and signpost them. Some strategies used successfully by schools include these. Getting parents involved in school events such as shows, assemblies, and sporting events. One school invited parents in making props and costumes for a musical performance in which some of their children featured. Another school issued special translated invitations to Sports Day and asked a parent who had previously been a gymnast before fleeing to give out medals. There are also opportunities for parental involvement in festival celebrations. Some schools have appointed parent ambassadors to help welcome new parents into the school, and perhaps to run coffee mornings or chatter groups in which parents can network, ask questions, and voice their concerns or opinions, which the ambassadors can then duly report back. Opening the school doors to community groups, perhaps hosting a Saturday school if one's around, can send a positive message and also help to build those links. Parents also welcome advice sessions on how to support their children's learning at home, including the maintenance and the development of their home language. If you can organise this and organise interpreters for it, parents would very much appreciate it. Opening the school to community groups set up to offer refugee support is another way to build links with the community and enable new parents to meet each other. Finally, making parents' evenings accessible through provision of interpreters is also going to make a big difference. Parents really do worry about their children and they want to know that their children are doing okay. To finish, I'd just like to share the results of a pupil focus group run by the National Institute of Economic and Social Research. They asked a group of pupils what they valued most in their new schools, and these were new to English pupils who had come to UK schools. And the results were all the things that they had feared they would not get. So friendship, kindness, and acceptance. If you think back to Emily's slide at the beginning of today's webinar, where we looked at the hopes and fears of new arrivals starting school, pupils said that making friends was the fastest way to feel happy and safe in school. So therefore, mentoring and buddy schemes were seen as helpful, as were clubs and activities where they could mix with other children. They commonly reported that their teachers in the UK were kind and helpful, and they attached great importance to being able to ask for help with class or homework. There was also a strong message that pupils valued being able to use and develop their mother tongue. But at the same time, they recognised the importance of becoming proficient in English in order to fit in and to progress with their education. And many pupils mentioned by name particular members of staff who had helped them with English language learning and or who had been able to communicate with them in their first language. So just to finish then, the message to schools from the children is very clear. It's welcome them, please, in all their diversity, help them to become part of the school community and value what they contribute to it. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Sarah. That was a really, really useful presentation, and thanks to Emily as well. I'm conscious of, very conscious of the time, and we've had a few questions, so we will answer those questions directly to you tomorrow and send those out with the link to the recording and all of the links that we've been sharing throughout the session. Just to flag that we've got a course coming up. If you could move the slides on, Sarah, that would be great. We've got a course coming up in September in the new term specifically on supporting new arrivals, which you might be interested in. And on the website, there's also guidance about working with refugees and new arrivals, which is in a downloadable PDF as well, and it's got all of the links to all the other areas on the website that will be particularly useful. So thank you very much for joining us and for some really excellent questions, and I'm glad to see that it's been useful. Thank you very much. Goodbye.
Thanks.
Bye.